Hello and welcome. My name is Justin Bracken, and I'm the acquiring editor here for the University of Utah Press. After a few years hiatus, we're back doing our virtual book events here, and we're hopefully going to be getting it back up and running in full swing pretty soon, and you'll see others of these. These events are being recorded in advance, and they'll be available on our YouTube channel, the University of Utah Press channel, and audio only on Spotify. The U of U Press podcast is where you can find us. So please follow us on those. You'll see new ones hopefully coming up in the coming weeks and months. And we're really excited to get these going again after our COVID-related hiatus. So today we are going to be discussing this book here. This is Holes in Our Moccasins, Holes in Our Stories, Apachean Origins and the Promontory, Franktown, and Dismal River Archaeological Records. This book was published in 2022. And it was edited by Jack Ives and Joel Janetsky. It is based on new archaeological work that they and others did at the Promontory Cave site and these other sites mentioned, following up in many ways upon Julian Stewart's earlier investigations there now over 90 years ago. And it builds outward from the editor's Apachean Origins group as well that I'm sure they will discuss. So we have both of those book editors with us today, Jack Ives and Joel Janetsky, as well as three of their contributors. And so I'm going to introduce them in turn, and I'll give them the chance to each introduce themselves and get this discussion started. So I'd like to welcome you all. Jack Ives, I'd like to introduce you first, and if you want to say a few words about yourself and your thoughts on the project. Jack, you're muted.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justin. In terms of my personal background in coming to this project, I did 2 degrees in Canada, a bachelor's degree at the University of Saskatchewan and a master's degree at the University of Alberta, where I eventually wound up as a professor. I went off to the University of Michigan and did my residency requirements, my comprehensive exams and whatnot, and then returned to Alberta, where I became a staff archaeologist with the Archaeological Survey of Alberta. A few years later, I became the director of that institution and later on worked at the Royal Alberta Museum. And I was essentially in senior management roles. So there was a real flavor of supporting research, but no real capacity to undertake larger new research projects. I had strong interests in language and particularly in kinship in the Dene world, which had been the subject of my dissertation work. So I worked on things like that, more or less. As I mentioned in the book, through a bit of a quirk of fate and that interest, I was invited to the second ArcLane conference in Canberra, Australia, and happened to travel there out of LA with Bob Bettinger and spent quite a bit of time in the audience with Bob. Gave a talk based on language and known archaeology in the North. And Bob poked me in the ribs and said words to the effect of, if you're serious about this, you really should look at the promontory materials because they're very much out of place in the Great Basin. A few years after that, the University of Alberta had a professorship available that I applied for. They wanted to form the Institute of Prairie Archaeology. And then suddenly before me, I had this opportunity to start and conduct field research projects. Joel and I had met in 2003 at the Rocky Mountain Anthropological Conference, and I was aware of Joel's Across the Desert West chapter, taking an interest in promontory materials. So as things evolved, traveling to the SAAs and other meetings, I began to stop by in Salt Lake City, where there was such tremendous help from Glenna Nielsen and Kathy Konkainen, Michelle Cottle, and others looking at the collections. And when this university opportunity became available, Joel and I began to have a serious conversation about how could we go about initially working with the collections. But I wanted to visit the caves sometime just to see them because the Stewart collections are so amazing. And in discussing that, it became apparent it was not so easy to contact the cave owners, which Joel took up. And he corresponded with George and Kumroa Chernos. And George and Kumroa have been such wonderful allies of the project and have become very good friends of us all. They oversaw protecting these caves from looting and other things. And at the end of the day, they opened their arms to a project that we conducted between 2010 was our first visit, 2011 and 2014, making some modest but significant excavations in both Cave 1 and Cave 2. So that's sort of how I came to this project, Dustin.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And now we'll turn over to your co-editor, to Jack's co-editor, Joel Janetsky. Joel, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Justin. Well, I have to say that I came to this project from a little bit different perspective because I was raised in the milieu of Eastern Great Basin archaeology under Jess Jennings' influence. And I came at the promontory issue because promontory and Fremont had always been sort of blurred. And I did a doctoral dissertation, kind of a thin one actually, on ethnohistory of Utah Valley, and got really interested in the recent prehistory of the valley and of the Eastern Great Basin, the Great Basin generally. So, and the 1994 paper that Jack makes reference to, in that paper, I said, what we need to do is go back to the caves and check some of this stuff out because it looks so different. And Julian Stewart, of course, had said it was very different, and even he proposed that there were visitors from the northern lands. So with that perspective, I was really receptive to what Jack's interests were when we met in 2003. But I had already looked at some recent sites, these sites that had ceramics on them, didn't look like Fremont. They certainly didn't date to the same time period as Fremont. And that was work done in Utah Valley. And these sites were dating later than most of the Fremont sites. So I was trying to figure out what the relationship was between those two time periods. And I did, with the conversations with Jack, I did talk to one of my colleagues, I think it was Kevin Jones, who had been to the caves, had told me that they were pretty well preserved. And in fact, in Cave 2, the profile was still extant. So we talked to the Chernos family, and they were really receptive. Of course, that's turned out to be a wonderful relationship. They had a keen interest in what we were doing and were there in the field with us every step of the way. And there are many facets to that experience. But nonetheless, my main interest was trying to resolve that difference, if it existed, between the Fremont and the promontory. And we had to really get some good dates and good stratigraphic control in order to approach that. So that's where I was coming from.
Great. Thank you so much. And so those, in addition to the two editors of the volume whom you've now met, we have three of the contributors out of several others that couldn't join us today. But the three contributors we have here, each of whom wrote to one or more chapters. We have Jess Metcalf, Ed Jolie, and Gabe Yanicki. And so I'll start. Jess, if you could please introduce yourself, and maybe if you want to just provide your background to the project, how you got involved, and the work that you did.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. So I'm an assistant professor at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And my specialization is a branch of archaeology, kind of known as archaeological science, and in particular using chemical compositions and isotopic compositions of ancient materials to find out about the past. And so my primary specialization within that is looking at large mammals and how they lived and interacted with humans and how we can learn about past environments from that. So for my PhD, I had worked mostly on mammoths and mastodons, but in 2014, I met Jack at the Paleo-American Odyssey conference. And we hung out and got to talking about all kinds of things, including, of course, promontory, where he told me about the amazing preservation of the caves, the abundance of bison remains within the caves, and these fascinating ideas about Apachean migrations. And so that was really the beginning of really productive collaboration between myself and Jack, including which has produced, a co-authored chapter in the book. And I want to acknowledge the primary author of that chapter is my colleague, Vandy Bowyer. So I was the second author on this chapter that we wrote about the environmental conditions at Promontory. But with Jack and Joel, we've also, I lead authored a paper in another venue about Promontory people migrating and moving and making long distance journeys based on chemical compositions of moccasins as well. So that's how I got into the project. And where I fit in.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. And so moving right along, Ed Jolie is here. And likewise, Ed, if you could just introduce yourself and maybe how you got on the project and your work that you did for it.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Justin. So I am the Claire Lee Tanner Associate Curator of Ethnology here at the Arizona State Museum and Associate Professor in the School of Anthropology here at the University of Arizona. I have long been interested in perishable technologies, baskets, textiles, those types of items of material culture that don't typically survive in most archaeological contexts. And I was trained in sort of my formative college years by Jim Adavasio, another Jess Jennings student. So there's a ancient University of Utah connection there in that regard, and then went on to pursue a master's degree with Catherine and Don Fowler at the University of Nevada, Reno. And that was my first introduction and intensive exposure to Great Basin perishable industries. And early on, I read about and heard about the promontory cave material and knew just from reading Stewart's report that it just seemed sort of out of place. We've got these really incredibly rich, long-term records of organic material culture across the Great Basin and adjacent regions. And so it's kind of like this unparalleled opportunity to work to develop these chronologies and technological traditions that we just really rarely have evidence for. But the promontory material always sort of struck out as kind of anomalous. And I think I bumped into Jack some years ago at the SA meetings and was picking his brain. And I think he sent me emails and questions about some Fremont coil basketry, and we just sort of continued to chat over the years. And I was fortunate enough to have one of my co-authors on the chapter in the volume, Libby Goldberg, was a former undergraduate student of mine who I very happily, although we were sad to not have her on campus, sent her to Jack, where she completed her master's degree in a much more extensive analysis of the perishables. And that from there has sort of opened up the doors to a lot more conversations about the impact of this material culture and what it means. And it's really exciting, fascinating stuff, not just because of its rarity, but just because we continue to learn so much more and are asking questions that we didn't even know we had.
Great. Thanks so much, Ed. And last but certainly not least, we have Gabe Janicki, who is going to, well, I'll turn it over to you, Gabe, and let you introduce yourself and likewise your contributions and your interactions with the project.
Well, hi there. Thanks for having me. I'm the curator of Western archaeology at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, Canada. But my involvement in the Promontory Project goes back at least to 2011, I suppose 2009, when I became a graduate student, a master's student of Jack's at the University of Alberta. And at that time, I was working on a project looking at a traditional meeting and gathering place involving traditional games in Southern Alberta. And I got to attend the first Dene Speakers Conference hosted by the Bruce Starlight at the Tsuut'ina Nation, where Jack was pitching the idea of going back to the caves. And then it's just serendipity from then on. I was in the right place at the right time in 2011 when Jack and Joel were organizing the first expeditions back to Promontory Caves 1 and 2, and I was invited to join on as an excavator. In the first few weeks of digging in Cave 1, we opened up 2 square meters. And in the 2 square meters of sondage, we started finding immense numbers of split cane dice, traditional gambling game, which happened to be something that I was already learning more about. And Jack put the question to me, what do you think all this means? And my answer was, well, people had to be gathering and meeting at this site. It couldn't have just been one group. There had to be neighbors involved in this setting for gaming and gambling games to have been so prolific. And it just so happened that in that first season, we were down camped on the lakeshore of Great Salt Lake, where Joel and our hosts, George and Kumaro Chernos, were pointing out finds along the lakeshore, including pottery, that looked really, really Fremont in origin. And I think that just became the impetus for what became my PhD, which was the question of whether the promontory people were meeting with Fremont neighbors in the immediate vicinity. And the dice became one contribution in a U of U publication a few years ago on traditional games in prehistory. And then the idea of the dice is that they're a game primarily played by women. Dice games ethnographically are a women's gambling game, which meant, well, how else could we approach the question of women at the promontory caves? And ceramics became the logical target there. And that's my contribution to the footprint, the Moccasins volume.
Thanks so much, Gabe. And we will certainly, in the later part of the discussion, I do want to return to your chapter and, you know, investigating women in the archaeological record and the results that you came to from that, because it's a very interesting chapter. So thank you all. It's great to be here with you all. And I think, you know, just from each of your descriptions, I think the listener could piece together a pretty good sense of the site and what's going on there and what was being investigated. I'd like to just kind of start, and I'll put this out broadly, just with kind of painting a picture of the setting, the site itself, the Chernus family being there to help guide you around, just you know, the locale and just kind of the biggest picture research questions that were at play here, the groups involved, the linguistic aspects. But let's just start, I guess, just with the site itself of Promontory Caves and what someone visiting there would be likely to see and archaeologically what their significance is. Would Joel and Jack, would you like to start this off, or?
Well, I'll say a few words and let Jack go from there. The caves are pretty spectacular. At least Cave 1 is very spectacular. It has a very large opening. Interiorly, there's a big rock fall right in the middle. When Stewart was there, it was very similar. We were able to reconstruct actually some of the photos that Stewart took. So little has changed. And in fact, his trench had largely healed over in Cave 1, but it is a large arching opening for Cave 1. And there's some rock art in the back of the cave, pretty interesting. Cave 2 is very different. The opening is very small. There's been some rock fall coming down, and actually either that or the activity of the excavations by Stewart, probably he was screening right in front of the cave, and I think it built up sort of a pile of debris in the front. And so the opening is a bit obscured. But inside, when we got inside at our first visit, you could see his exposed profile there, although people had been picking at it a little bit, so it was eroding, but nonetheless, it was very visible. The cave is a little bit dim. Both have a problem with, both are dry caves, and so you're dealing with the dust, etc., when you're doing excavations. So it was a challenge. We struggled with the amount of material coming out of the cave, and so trying to screen things and trying to recover everything that was coming out. We had to deal with some issues about what to take home and what not to take home. But we ended up taking almost everything that we recovered, mostly rocks we left there. But it was a challenge. Cave excavations are a challenge because of the dust and the complicated stratigraphy. People themselves are confined, in the past, are confined to a narrow area, and so they sit on top of where they were before. And so they basically manufacture new layers that obscures previous ones. They dig into the cave floor for whatever reason. That makes for very complicated excavations. Go, Jack.
Jack, you're muted.
I should say at the outset that Joe warned us as we began the project, warned me that, you know, he said, Jack, a dry cave can end your career. And the meaning of that is there's so much material you recover that there's a great obligation to report on vast quantities of artifacts. I don't think we excavated more than 2 to 2.5 cubic meters. We wanted to get more dating material and create some sections in Stuart's previous sections. But as it turned out, there was a deeper part of the cave. It took us 3 small field seasons to get to the base of that. And it was a remarkable experience in that regard. I guess I have a memory of meeting George and Kumaroa at the north end of Promontory Peninsula. We shook hands and I don't know, there was an immediate affinity. I think Joel feels this too. We were just comfortable with each other. This was in 2010. And so we crossed the Promontory Range, a bit of an arduous journey with trucks and whatnot, and then hiked into the caves. And I remember as we got up on what we call the high trail, going to the caves, and we're nearing the caves, a raven flew by. And I took that as a good sign. Raven in the north, of course, is a profoundly important creature with many properties. And, you know, we entered the caves and the spectacular place. Just not very long before we proceeded into the caves, there was the hoof and part of the lower limb of a bison lying there. When we came back the next year to excavate, I discovered it was even more of that limb. This is the kind of thing that Jess could begin to work on ultimately in terms of the isotopic studies. And it's the hoof, it's the fur, it's the hide. It's just, see, my background is working in the Canadian North in the boreal forest, which unfortunately is really burning this year. One of the other challenges there for archaeologists is that the soil is relatively acidic. And so anything that's organic in nature, and that includes bone, even, which is quite important for studying economy in the past, that sort of thing, everything disappears but the stone tools. So the sudden difference between that type of record and what you see in the Promontory Caves was really striking. I'm fond of saying I've ruined several graduate careers by having students work on this, because in terms of hunter-gatherer archaeology, it's pretty much all downhill after you worked in the Promontory Caves. There wouldn't be 5 or 10 minutes go by where someone at a screen would say, "Oh my God, look at this," or "What is this?" Because we're seeing many aspects of material culture you don't normally see as an archaeologist. I'd also like to stress that we were aware too of where we were. Gabe mentioned working with our good friend and colleague, Bruce Starlight, now Dr. Bruce Starlight, having received an honorary PhD just this past summer that I was very pleased to attend. And making contacts in the Dene world. We were also aware, however, that we were working in what is today Northern Shoshone country. And I'd like to acknowledge the assistance and warm welcome that we got from people like Patty Timpimbo with the Northern Shoshone community. Another motivating factor for this is that while archaeologists and Indigenous people have had complicated relationships, not always happy ones, we have done our best to reach out into these different worlds to make contact. But another underlying motive is that the Stuart collections are immense. There is no end of productive research questions one might ask about them. But for many years, but for the effort of Kathy Konkainen at the University of Utah, those collections remained in boxes and hallways and that sort of thing. And with the White House grant for the bicentennial, Kathy started bringing the promontory materials forward. To me, it seems an obligation of archaeologists to be reaching out to First Nations communities and letting them know these incredibly powerful collections exist. We'll perhaps talk about it in the future, but things like moccasins are extremely evocative. And honestly, Justin, they inspire tears and they're complicated tears. They're tears of joy, but tears of sadness also. So one of the profound experiences of being in the caves is to hear Shoshone and Dene voices. Bruce Starlight conducted naming ceremonies, including for Patty in the caves. It's a profoundly emotionally affecting thing to visit the caves in that regard. So I said a fair amount there. I think I'll stop now.
Let me just add, Justin, I talked about the challenges of the excavations, but of course we were working in Utah, and I failed to mention that I'm retired from the Department of Anthropology at Brigham Young University now, but at the time I was still active. So we were able to use the material, the equipment, and everything from Brigham Young University. But getting it up to the caves was a challenge because we could park within a mile or so, Jack, of the caves. No, it's probably closer than that, but it was quite a long trip to get up all that equipment, the screens, and all the other material that you need to do an excavation. And there's a great difference in the caves. As I already mentioned, there was an exposed profile in Cave 2, and we could see the complicated stratigraphy, which we then began to clean up and label and photograph and document however we do it. And that, as a consequence of that, the caves are very different in that Cave 2 has a clear record all the way back 10,000 years, whereas Cave 1, we were going down sort of sight unseen, level by level. We couldn't see any exposed stratigraphy. So we went down until we got done with, pretty much done with the promontory material. Got out of the promontory material, as we could tell by the appearance of ceramics. Then went a bit lower than that, and that was it. So the caves are very different stratigraphically, logistically. They were both a challenge in their own way. I have to say with Jack that the experience with the Chernos family in so many different ways, the fact that their daughter, Kumaro, we haven't mentioned yet, is Maori, an indigenous group, of course, from New Zealand. So she was very sensitive to the issue of indigenous peoples, and their daughter had married a Navajo fellow. And they brought their daughter and her husband brought their child there to the caves. And all of that just really was quite emotional in the way that Kumaro welcomed Bruce Starlight to the caves. All of that was quite emotional. I won't go into detail here just out of respect for them, but it's an amazing experience from that perspective as well.
Yes, Kumaro was holding Kiana's baby at one point when we were in the caves, and I overheard her to say, "Perhaps your ancestors lived here once." And there were many moments like that that really affected all of us on a personal and emotional level. And that almost plays into the title of the volume. I'd worked very closely with Sally Rice, my linguist colleague, now retired from the University of Alberta also, and Bruce Starlight in convening large gatherings of Dene people from across Western North America, literally from Arizona to the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Alaska. And for one of those sessions, we called it Holes in Our Moccasins, Holes in Our Stories. And the meaning behind that was people would often ask, is this like a moccasin factory? And probably to a degree it was, in that worn out moccasins would need to be replaced. But the moccasins we do find are primarily worn out. They're heavily patched, worn out, and there's not much more can be done with them. So they've been discarded. So that's an archaeological finding. There are ways in which oral traditions and indigenous perceptions of the past and archaeology can, we believe, fruitfully flow together and tell a more comprehensive story about the past. So that was the genesis of a volume title. And we had cast around with several when one of the other people who'd been working on our project or around our project, Sunday Islett, said, "Why don't you just call it that conference name that you gave for your gathering at Sutena outside of Calgary in Alberta?" So that's how we came to the volume title.
Thank you. Yeah, and as I read through the book, as I thought about the the various research projects, sub-projects, I suppose, that were pursued, that they're contained in the book, the tangible nature of it and the material record that you were able to pull from the dry caves really seems to resonate. And I think, when, especially if you're used to a more well-preserved material record of ceramics, of stone tools, there are certain things with hair, with human hair or animal hair, with these moccasins made from hide and twine and other things that I think really, I would say perhaps brings you closer to the makers, makes you feel maybe more of a kinship, or it's just more the time that's passed seems to sort of evaporate. And I was wondering if you could speak more to the and maybe Ed, this is a good place for you to jump in about the work you did, where just where you're performing scientific research. You're investigating these things and trying to get, the data from them. But also at the same time, there's this affective part of it, affective part of it that is really, more present than maybe with other materials.
I think you hit the nail on the head really, really well with that, Justin, because it certainly has long been evocative for me in terms of underscoring how much we're missing in most archaeological settings, and that when you have this exceptional preservation, you're just really struck not only by the material diversity, the variability of objects and things, but you do get a sense for this connection with the past in a way that is sometimes difficult to come by alternatively with perhaps bone or stone tools. It's not that you can't, but it is a very different feeling. I think part of it's born out of this. We expect to find the durable, the ceramics and the stone tools. And so when you're confronted by drawers and drawers and bags full of little bits of string and sinew, bits of worn out footwear, it very immediately humanizes the past for you in ways that I think it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around. And in fact, not to speak entirely for Libby, but I think that was really part of her experience as an undergraduate, working in my lab at the time, exposed to this material. She, like so many of us, was sort of bitten by the bug and hooked, and pursued study and analysis of a sample of quarters that Jack and Joel sent us, and then went on to pursue more detailed study with Jack at the University of Alberta. And, having the opportunity to go and examine some of these objects, it brings to the foreground not just how much we're missing, but that human aspect in terms of the decision-making processes that go into the sewing of a moccasin, or the manufacture of a basket or a mat or a bag. You get this preservation, and because of the additive nature of these technologies, the very decision-making process, the manufacturing process, is objectified in the finished product. And I think people take for granted the fact that, when you look cross-culturally, the vast majority of human societies, most of what people made and use on a day-to-day basis is perishable. And so when we have really exceptional preservation, it's not an exaggeration to say that, as Walt Taylor did in his work in northern Mexico caves and rock shelters, finished fiber artifacts outnumber stone tools by a factor of 20-1. Work that Dale Crouse and his colleagues had been engaged in on the Northwest Coast have yielded, tens of thousands of artifacts, and upwards of 95% of what they recovered is wood and perishable because it's preserved in these waterlogged contexts. So it drives home on the one hand for me, and what I try and convey to others is not just how amazing it is that we have this sort of exceptional preservation, but really how little we're working with when we don't have access to this really unique record. And so it's a real privilege to be able to work on that and share that with other people.
I'd add to what Ed's saying, Justin. Sorry.
No, please.
You sent, with a thing like a moccasin, you sense another person from the past. You can see the imprint of their foot. If it's a child's moccasin that would fit in the palm of your hand, we've just had our first grandchild. You make a personal connection with these things, and it's stronger for Indigenous people. Both Patty and Bruce, for instance, have talked to me about how they sense ancestors from the past in terms of being in and near the caves. So it is really an affecting thing. I know in the north, some of the earlier Boisian era ethnographies for the Ngalik people, Dene people in northern Alaska, 95% of the assemblage, as Ed is saying, where we've looked at it ethnographically, is in fact perishable. The other thing I'd like to stress is that I feel archaeologists should always teach humility. There's so very much we don't know about the past. And intriguingly, even when the archaeological record is as rich as this one, it just seems to cause more questions. What Ed was referring to, that sense of what we're missing. I guess it goes back to that saying, there's what you don't know and there's what you don't know you don't know. And these types of settings really tell you a great deal about what you don't know, about what you don't know.
Well, thank you both. Yeah. And I don't know if this is the right segue, but this got me thinking for Jess about your chapter and your work on, the ecological scenarios that were faced by the occupants there, their relation with bison. And, this, of course, is perhaps a less, more, I don't want to say proxy based, but it's more, it's less direct perhaps than holding a moccasin in your hand. And I wanted to switch over to that and sort of how your work, informs us about the different setting they were living within, the occupants of this cave, how they were interacting. You mentioned the bison, the lower leg that you encountered early on, or it was mentioned before. Can you just speak more to that and how that sort of fills in the same picture from a completely different angle there?
Yeah, so the work that I do and the work that I did with Vandy in this chapter kind of, you might say, paints like a backdrop in a way for what was happening at Promontory in terms of the environmental conditions. So in that chapter, we used pollen. Vandy did the pollen analyses from bison dung that was found in the promontory layers of the cave. And then my work was a chemical isotopic analysis of the dung, both of which provide complementary lines of evidence about, in particular, we were looking at how dry or how arid or conversely how wet it was at the time that people were occupying the caves. And this was important because previous researchers had suggested that, well, we know there were droughts across the Great Basin and other areas, but here we're looking at a very short period of time, a couple of generations, as Jack has modeled, in which people lived in the promontory caves. So how do those long-term records of droughts and aridity correspond with this little short human lifespan, two generations of time when people were intensively occupying the promontory caves? So with that in mind, the work that Vandy and I did in the book chapter showed that there was no evidence from these proxies for severe droughts while the promontory people were in the caves. And that makes sense because, we know from the assemblages in the caves themselves that there was an abundance of bison remains. There was good hunting to be had near the promontory caves. And so it was not particularly dry. We're not saying it was extremely wet, but it was really, our records suggest no drier than Utah is today, or perhaps a bit wetter around the caves. And that created the conditions that would have allowed grasses to flourish and bison to inhabit the area. So really good hunting conditions for people while they occupied the caves. And unfortunately, there's been the suggestion that maybe people left the caves because there was this severe drought. But we can only study the remains that we have. So once the bison are gone and the people are gone, we can't assess the aridity at that time. So our results don't preclude a drought like that was really started when people left, but we know that when people were there were not drought conditions that were happening. It was an equitable kind of environment for people to live in.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I can actually tie that pretty well to Gabe's work. If we can turn to Gabe now, looking at ceramics, ethnogenesis is right in the title as well, but looking at, within this bison hunting lifestyle and knowing the general climate conditions that people were living within, looking for gender in general in the archaeological record, of course, is really important. It can be fraught. It's, what are the touchstones? What are the implicit assumptions? But, Gabe, in your chapter, you tease these aspects out and really see it through the lens of ceramics and what the implications of those are. So if I'll turn it to you, if you want to speak a little more to that interaction and how the bison hunting lifestyle interacts with these other elements.
Sure. One of the implicit assumptions about ceramics is that they're primarily made by women, especially in the past in traditional societies. When we look at ceramic assemblages, we are seeing the craft work of women potters and communities of women. And another implicit assumption is that these traditions are learned mother to daughter or grandmother to granddaughter over time, and that lineages of pottery production techniques are learned and passed down over time, and that these differ between communities. One of the things that always has stood out about the promontory caves, is that the pottery is different. It's got a very black paste, and calcite temper is very, very common, whereas around Great Salt Lake, around the same period or in the centuries prior, there's a lot of use of sand and crushed rock and mica tempers. So promontory stands out as different, but not always different, because there are examples of calcite temper showing up at a few sites on the northeast bay of the Great Salt Lake, and then further east into the Uinta Basin. It's all very interesting stuff, but it's not just about assumptions. Pottery ties a lot of different threads that we're talking about together. One of the other factors is preservation, whereas we're talking about the incredible preservation of fiber perishables and moccasins, bison hide, bone. These aren't always things that can be compared to other sites, but pottery is something that does stay preserved at other archaeological sites around the Great Basin, open air sites in particular. It gives us something more, well, readily comparable. And then there's the bison factor. And how does pottery relate to bison is kind of a long story, and that's what the chapter, I think, is all about in the end, is why is the pottery different at the caves, but not really. It's not really that different. And that ties in again to the gaming and gambling material, which sort of set the stage for looking at the pottery, and especially women at the caves. So I mentioned earlier that dice are quite prevalent, especially at Promontory Cave 1. And it's not just one variety of gaming die. There's split cane die, which are absolutely prolific. I mean, once the numbers are all calculated, there are probably thousands of dice represented in unexcavated portions of the cave, but well over 150, I believe, from the excavated sample so far. But also split bison rib dice that are quite distinct from the polished bone dice that are common, as Joel has mentioned in earlier work, at Fremont sites. There are porcupine or beaver tooth dice, which you see a lot more in the Pacific Northwest, and split stick dice, which extend more into the Great Basin and the Southwest. Lots of different varieties, which is unusual, but it suggested that there are a lot of different gaming traditions represented in this one population, and particularly among the women of the Promontory Caves people, which by extension would imply that maybe we could look at that through the ceramics. And looking at the ceramics, sure enough, there is quite a lot of variability, in spite of what I think Julian Stewart in his pioneering monograph implied. It's not a single type of pottery being produced there. There is an abundance of calcite tempered pottery, but also the more familiar sand and crushed rock and mica that you see at the Fremont sites. And finding the site along the lakeshore that we now call Cherno Springs in honor of the site's discoverers and our hosts. The two sites, Cherno Springs and Promontory Cave 1, in my paper, form a really interesting contrast between the typical Fremont pottery of the prior several centuries, as seen at Cherno Springs, and a house floor with adobe chunks and structural wood, a typical pit house type structure from the looks of it, even though a small portion was excavated. Compared to, the calcite tempered pottery that we see at Cave 1. But the implication is that women from different backgrounds, including Fremont women, were being recruited into the Promontory population. And one of the main reasons, I think, for that is the fact that the Promontory people were big game hunters with a big focus on bison. Hunting bison in large numbers creates a huge amount of work. There's a huge labor requirement involved in processing all the meat, especially in a mass kill. When multiple bison are killed in one event, there's a lot of need for meat and hides, bone to get processed in a short amount of time. And bison hunters, especially on the Great Plains, form alliances. They intermarry, form region-wide social networks to ensure that the labor requirements and the social capital is all in place to process these enormous hunts. And I think that's exactly what's happening. And it's represented by women from other groups coming into the promontory population in the 13th century.
Thank you, Gabe. And thank you all. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Jess. I think this is a great coverage of kind of some of the specific lines and how they sort of converge on different results. And I think, Gabe, you set me up really well here for a return to the discussion of Julian Stewart, because we've kind of beat around the bush. We've talked about him in different ways. I think, just without going too far back, but I think at least to kind of set the stage maybe for the listener, now that we're, maybe approaching an hour in our conversation, about Julian Stewart's work there and the degree to which this more recent work that was done by everybody here was building off of that, some of the interpretations that he made from, nearly, at this point, almost 90 years ago, and how some of those were sort of ignored for a long time, and which of those maybe have been supported by this work, which have been refined, and just sort of, I guess, just the degree to which the work now and the big result, the big picture results that you've come to, how those play off of his initial work at the site. And I'll turn it back to Joel and Jack and whoever else wants to chime in on that.
Well, I'll go ahead and comment. Julian Stewart, of course, is one of the major figures in American anthropology and was tremendously influential in the Great Basin as he studies Great Basin peoples, and is published in a number of places about them and his ethnographic work there. But he did do some archaeology, and he did some on the Columbia River. And before he got to the University of Utah in the 1930s, when he got to the University of Utah, he was aware of some observations by another fellow from the University of Utah, Brian Cummings, who had been to the caves and had written, I guess he wrote a newspaper article that came out in, what was it, 1912, I think, and describing the caves, and he made observations about the bison remains that were obvious beyond on the surface of the caves. And Stewart was also aware of the fact that the caves were being exploited, that is, vandalized by collectors. So he decided as early as 1930, this was happening, that is the vandalism. So he went out there in 1930 and 1931 and did some pretty extensive excavations. It was a little hard to figure out exactly where he excavated, although he did report on it, and he has some maps that show the extent of his excavations, but it's a little bit unclear after our work just exactly how deep some of his excavations were. The Cave 2 excavations are more clear, and he took a huge heart out of the cultural material in Cave 2. But his conclusions, as you've already alluded to, Justin, were very different from the perspectives of those in the Eastern Great Basin, not so much at the time, but later, and that his findings were largely ignored. And that's when he made drew the conclusion that there might have been some people from northern climes visiting there, and he made that based on the style of the perishables, specifically the moccasins, and which were abundant and which were not similar at all to either what are called Fremont moccasins or Shoshone moccasins. They were quite different. But as I said earlier, the primary interest subsequent to his arrival, subsequent to his tenure at the University of Utah, we have a number of people, but eventually it was Jess Jennings who came there. And he was very interested in a couple of things, but one of those was the Fremont, which was a popular topic of those doing field work because the Fremont mounds were so obvious, and the material recovered was quite exciting. A lot of ceramics and a lot of ornaments, et cetera, et cetera. So the proposal that Stewart made, and he even comments later in the review of one of the the publications by Jack Rudy. He says, why is it that nobody's paying any attention to this possibility that Athabascans were in fact present in the Northern Great Basin in these, as we can see in these caves? So in a way, what we were doing was testing some of the conclusions of Julian Stewart. I personally was skeptical of the first dates to come out of the caves were the first radiocarbon dates were run by Mel Akins, a well-respected archaeologist, worked at the University of Utah and also dug in Hogab Cave, massive site, not too far from the caves. But they concluded, based on those dates, which were falling in the 1200s AD, that these were in fact related to the Fremont occupation, because Fremont, we understood, figured they had lingered at least until the late 1200s. And subsequent dating by Kathy Kincannon, who Jack has alluded to, also came out with those dates. But personally, I thought those were wrong, because the work that I had done in Utah Valley on sites with promontory pottery, so-called promontory pottery, which gets us back to the promontory pottery issue and the mixing with Fremont, they were much later, well, at least a couple hundred years later. So it was much to my chagrin when we began to getting dates very similar to Kathy Kincannon's, and we began to look at all of this in a very different way. And much of it supports Julian Stewart's findings. But I have to say that I can remember many interactions with colleagues at the time, challenging each other about, well, you say those are Fremont ceramics, what about these ceramics? And discovering that there were some difference in the age of those ceramics was a very important thing, and the promontory cave work helped us determine that. I'll just stop there and let Jack make a comment or two about this.
Yes, thanks, Joel. With regard to Stewart's work, I would I think of the era in a couple of ways, on a human level, and also it being the tail end of the Voisian era. The work that he did was really credible. It's not like you look through Stewart's material and say, well, this is wrong, that's wrong. It's really, by and large, on the mark. And when you think of what he had to say in his Ancient Caves monograph, that whoever was living in the caves had been there long enough to catch what we would today call the tail end of the Fremont era, well in advance of radiocarbon dating, he had absolutely nailed it. And I'd reinforce what Joel said. His last kick at the cat, I think, was his American Antiquity Review of the Rudy article about the site in Nevada, saying, why didn't anybody take this identity issue seriously? Of course, the trend in anthropological theory would be towards cultural ecology. And the other end of that would become human behavioral ecology. So things went in a completely different direction. On a human level, Virginia Cairns has done a lot of detailed biographic work about Stewart, and it was a very interesting time in his life. You see his excitement corresponding with his supervisor, Kroeber, in California. He had secured a permanent appointment at the University of Michigan, which of course one day would have a giant, prominent anthropology department. It was like he was set. But he fell in love with the psychologist there. And she had secured an appointment at the University of Utah. So in the language of today or the recent past, Stewart was actually the trailing spouse. She had secured this job and he came. And I think when he was doing this work in 1930 and 1931, he seemed to have happy and unhappy phases of his life. At this time, he was a relatively happy person. You could see the excitement he's expressing to Kroeber in the correspondence we've read that you can see at Berkeley and so on. He subsequently became profoundly unhappy with events as they turned out, and turned away from that. But it's a particularly interesting era in his career, at a time when there was much more four-field practice. He was interested in ceremony, bear dances, did some archaeology in different places, as Joel was pointing out. People had a hand in all these things, and of course, with the degree of specialization, we only have to think of the kind of field that Jess is in, how much you know. But there was an interesting fertilization. So we've tended to use the term transdisciplinary in our research. How can we, to me at least, return to some of the sense of that four-field approach where we have things flowing together. Because I feel part of our research has looked at language, genetics, and archaeological records, and I feel the information is flowing together in a way. It's not like we're seeing huge contradictions amongst these different and highly demanding and specific approaches to looking at data about the past.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that I think you've set me up well for another level of zooming out that I would like to do, which is, we've talked about the work generally and, how the results and how this impacts, reflects back upon Stewart, I should say. What I wanted to kind of broach a little bit, and with the proper caveats, I understand, applying research into the past to the present is always fraught. But we're talking about climate change. We're talking about local ecological niches. We're talking about the Great Salt Lake, which of course has been undergoing a lot of fluctuation recently, nearly drying out, being recently mostly infilled, I guess, by the snowmelt from this past winter. What are you seeing today? Are you seeing current effects at the site? I know it's maybe been a few years since the work, but the site itself being affected by recent climate shifts. Do you see maybe new sites emerging or being under threat? And also, do you see any lessons from the adaptations that people were making at this time, at the time in the past, to maybe our current situation with obviously a large metropolis around the Great Salt Lake and many more people living here? And I know this might catch you all off guard, but I don't know if there's any way to speak to it. Ed, Gabe, Jess, from your particular perspectives, and of course Joel and Jack as well, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in and say there are many parables that we can draw from the type of record that exists at Promontory. In fact, I don't even quite know where to grab it, Justin. I mean, one looks at New York Times pictures and whatnot of what's happening to Great Salt Lake. Then I see the zone of precipitation accompanying Hillary as it impacts California, and I'm wondering about Great Salt Lake. It is alarming to see the extent to which the lake is going down. Joel could probably comment on what might be exposed by that. I would just stress that, well, first of all, in terms of archaeological thought, there's this immense thing that happened in Western North America. Dene speakers spread from the far north, the North Slope of Alaska, well, even into northern Mexico, and it's received very little attention. And I feel that ought to speak to us today because a series of things are relevant to that. A massive volcanic eruption in the AD 800s may have contributed to the initial movement of Dene people. It's been overlooked. It's perhaps been overlooked sometimes in negative ways. Well, that many Dene people are adept at copying others and whatnot. Another way to look at it in the face of the profound change that all global societies are facing today is what kind of cultural genius the Dene people have to be able to move through these environments, manage social relationships in them, to work effectively in completely different environments. I'm fond of saying that Dene people went against the grain in this very tumultuous 13th century. Some people were being forced to give up horticulture because of profound southwestern drought. Dene people lived in the best watered area of the world, the Canadian subarctic, in terms of fresh water. They're moving into these incredibly arid environments and seeing things like maize horticulture and saying, well, we could give that a try. And then when the Spanish show up with sheep and goats, well, some of the work that Wade Campbell has been doing, now appointed at Boston University, they become pastoralists. This, as a parable for the modern world, this capacity to adapt to radically changing circumstances, I think is something that we should very much pay attention to. There's a couple of handles that I would grab there.
Does anyone else have yeah, Gabe, please.
Yeah, I'll just add that in the 13th century, when the Promontory people arrived at the Great Salt Lake, that was a world in flux. So, this has happened before where horticulture had failed or was in the midst of failing, at least in the Great Salt Lake area. We have a good indication that Fremont people were living as wetlands foragers. And the arrival of big game focused people and bison hunting people may have presented a very attractive change. And so going back, you mentioned ethnogenesis before as a topic of the work I did. I didn't really grab the bit there, but how people adapt to change and the changes in identity that result, it's a big part of the story. And I think part of it is about making alliances, friendships, learning new ways. It's not just a Dene story, I think, that's going on around the Promontory Caves in the Great Salt Lake area. And maybe migration stories never are. There's a facet of people newly arrived in the region, but learning from the people that are already there and then learning from each other. And I think the pottery tells a story of people learning from each other and new identities taking shape over time. And is there a parable there for the modern world? Maybe.
Well, thanks so much. I'm sorry.
I might comment about the modern world as compared to the world that the folks in this region, that is the Eastern Great Basin generally, were living in. I just was talking to my sister who lives in Phoenix, and her comment has been, whatever happened to the monsoons? Utah's getting the monsoons, but the first inkling of monsoons is really spin off from Hillary. There's been very little rain. I mean, probably Ed can speak to this as well. But one of the reasons we think that the Fremont were not doing so well at farming is because there was a shift in monsoonal moisture at about the 1300s, which, as Jack has already alluded to, was a very dynamic time. We think we know for sure that Apachean peoples were in those caves in the 1200s, but they didn't stay. Obviously, when the pioneers arrived, or when mountain men arrived here, they were not Apachean speakers. They were Numic speakers. They were Ute and Shoshone. And so we have, talking about migrations, that whole book across the West is about whether or not, many concluding that they did have these people who spoke this Shoshonean or Numic language arriving in the Eastern Great Basin at around late 1200s, 1300s AD, when we have a very different suite of material things that show up in archaeological sites. But unfortunately, one of those was promontory pottery. But the promontory pottery doesn't persist. That's why this recent period in the Eastern Great Basin is so fascinating. I mean, Jess Jennings, whom I owe much to in terms of my career, he pretty much ignored this time period. There was in his book, Prehistory of the Eastern Great Basin, he dedicates about 4 pages to the post-Fremont era and basically presumes that there is something like a Numic presence in the Eastern Great Basin after the Fremont left. But we know now that it's much more complicated than that. And not only that, the archaeological sites from that recent time period are rich with tremendous information to offer. So I certainly don't think we have answered all the questions, but because it's such a dynamic time period. When we look at just such patterns as in the obsidian trade, at around 1200, obsidian was largely coming in the Utah Valley. Now, that was kind of my frame of reference for all of this project. Obsidian was coming from the south. By the promontory period, almost all of the obsidian is coming from the north. Why is that? Those are some of the questions that we have and what you're trying to answer. I do think that the work that Jess has been doing environmentally and what she offers, she and her co-authors, collaborators there, and the work that she has done is really, really important because it gives us some really good insights into what climate was like at that time period. So these shifts in climate, over the past centuries, even millennia, are really important in trying to understand and the implications for a shifting climate as we see today.
Absolutely. And actually, I did want to turn it over to Jess. I think, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, thanks. Just adding to what Joel was saying and also going back to what Jack said and your question about, I think, maybe lessons for the present. I think one of the things that we can learn from Promontory and from Dene people today and not only Dene people, but other Indigenous people, or my Anishinaabe neighbors here, Coast Salish people on the West Coast, you hear Indigenous people saying they are the land. And so their Indigenous cultures are very in tune to the environment and the land. And I think we see that at Promontory with the fact that people left, before we have any trace of any drought, if a drought exists, or before we have any evidence for, negative environmental shifts, people and bison, were intertwined, and people were reading their environment and knew their environment and made intelligent decisions to adapt to their environment in those past conditions. And so from other research that we've done, we also know that Promontory people had made long distance journeys. So they're really very aware, not just of their local environment, but the much broader landscape that they were living in. And so being in tune, in touch with the environment, allowed those people in the Promontory caves and others to make these well-informed, really knowledgeable decisions about what to do and how to live and where to move. And I think, that lack of feeling that we're part of the environment or the earth, and really like understanding that in our modern society is one of our failings as a modern society, and something we can really learn from Indigenous people who are still around everywhere today.
Great, thank you so much. If there are no other comments on that in particular, I wanted to just kind of zoom out again. I guess I keep saying that, but thinking about the caves themselves and these questions and these research directions that have been pursued. I guess two-parter. First, is more work planned at the caves? And secondly, whether or not there is more work planned, what are the directions for future research to flesh out these questions, the answers to these questions in more detail about migration, about these cultures in contact? Where do you see this research projecting into the future?
Well, I could tackle part of that. Returning to the theme we were just on, I am by no means a Southwestern archaeologist, although I've tried in recent years to learn as much as I can. I did confer with my University of Calgary colleague, the late Jane Kelly, who was a Southwestern specialist, and she would ask me, when was all this going on, Jack? And I said, well, in the 13th century. And Jane just said, oh my, so much happens in that century. And Ed would know more about this, as would Joel. We see a historical playing out of trends that we can trace back to Chaco, the consequences of Chaco and the different shifts, stances that Puebloan societies progressively took. So to me, the articulation of these human histories, people coming from the north, and not just coming from the north, but many people being involved, the world would be irrevocably changed after the 13th century. And as Joel's saying, little attention being paid to this time period, but it's hovering right there at the edge of the historical world, the circumstances that would lead to the historical world. The people living in the caves were, archaeology can tell a lot of sad stories, can't it? Ozymandias-wise, things that went badly wrong in the Mayan world or wherever you would like to think. At this particular moment in time, the people living in the caves, I think they were thriving. There are scads of children in terms of the demographics revealed by the Moccasins. They were extremely proficient bison hunters. We'd like to know more about how they did that. We do feel there's evidence that it was likely happening in the pass above the caves, near the caves. But this community was really thriving, and I see that as a kind of magnet drawing people in. And if I were to put it in simple, possibly humorous terms, the village site down at Cherno Springs that Gabe worked at, I mean, if you were to invite people in, it would be, would you like some pickleweed gruel? As opposed to up at the caves, it's Tony Romas and ribs, right? And we've seen even in some genetic literature, the questioning of why would people ever join these other societies? I mean, they had architecture, ceremonial life and whatnot. In those human terms, the 13th century was forcing a choice as to what you would do. The Fremont Coastal World would end by the 1400s. And I think the Promontory Caves are showing us what kind of a magnet that bison hunting world could be to people. This is a lifestyle I could adapt to and change to, and that's why. And as the genetic evidence so clearly shows, many people, particularly women, were entering the nascent Apachean societies. The genetic evidence shows that very clearly. Never mind the ceramic evidence and other things. So, in terms of zooming out, that would be my take on that. That there are critically important historical process types of questions and answers that are well worth asking in a day and age where climate change is forcing massive migration, where people are involved in intolerable circumstances and will do anything to try to escape them. It's going to be the reality of this century and the next one. In terms of future research, I think for Joel and I, it's going to be more a question of living out a dry cave can end your career sort of thing. We have obligations to work with these materials, and that's going to occupy us in the latter stages of our career. I would say, especially for Ed and Gabe and Jess and many other younger researchers, the number of meaningful anthropological problems that we could frame for the promontory materials, it seems to me limitless. It's a question of your imagination. So I certainly hope people take up more of these things with such incredibly rich collections. Ours to a degree, but most particularly Stewart's, which dwarfs ours. All these collections are now united at your institution at the University of Utah. So I would hope that goes on in the future. We're not planning to go back to the caves, but perhaps to visit. There is an indication of a hunting blind in the pass below the saddle. We might like to do a bit more testing there, but that has proved difficult as George and Coomeraw have aged. And in fact, land ownership has changed for some of the surrounding lands. I guess the final thought I would conclude with is we do have concerns and would be more than willing to help George and Coomeraw if any advice is wanted. As you probably know, many caves in the Great Basin have been looted to nothingness. Not even dirt remains. And this record, there are substantial residual deposits in the caves. In the long term, this is an extraordinary human record in all of Western North America, maybe even globally, one could say, that really merits careful thought for the future. I'll stop there.
Jack, I want to add to your comment about the caves and their preservation. The Chernows family has already made serious and significant sacrifices to protect those caves and what's in them. I do want to go back for just a second about a broader view. And of course, as I've already mentioned, my view came from Utah Valley, which broadens the view of promontory just a bit. We should mention that Stewart also worked in Utah Valley and found what he thought were remains similar to what he had found in the caves. But past scholars like Mel Akins and also James Gunderson speculated about what happened to those people who had lived in the caves and had generated that kind of a material culture that you see in the caves, especially the ceramics. And so Akins speculated that they had moved across the Rockies onto the eastern plains, became the Dismal River. Folks, that's another whole field of inquiry, whereas James Gunderson sort of argued in a different direction. And that won't get into that in detail, but the point is that in order to get a broader view, which I have to say, Jack Ives is so good at bringing a broader view to all of this, we got involved with people like Kevin Gilmore and others, and people who have been working in the Dismal River, and they make up a very important complement to our work in the caves and bringing their chapters to this volume, which I think are really important. Franktown Cave, which Gilmore and his colleagues report on, all of that is very important stuff. So I think we need to have that broader view if we're really going to understand what we mean by promontory. We have to be careful using that term a little bit. But the volume certainly provides that for us, I think.
Yeah, the term promontory phase kind of gets stretched all out of archaeological shape, whereas there are scatterings of moccasins in this style in Wyoming, and Kevin Gilmore and Bonnie Clark, another existing collection of great importance, Franktown Cave. They've taken so much care with that. It's striking. I mean, in doing this research, I'm thinking, here's this Canadian guy, and this unbelievably rich and informative collection is kicked around for like 8 decades, and nobody explored it at all. There are all these traces extending down in front of the mountain. And now we're exploring with Ed, promontory styles of moccasins are cropping up at well-known Puebloan sites in the Mesa Verde area, at Aztec Ruin, and now at Montezuma Castle. There is a pattern there. I would stress that I constantly question, could we be wrong about this? There's a broader phenomenon, I think, about this interaction from plains-related worlds and the southwestern world. Apachean ancestors, Navajo and Apache peoples were incredibly important too, but it's not just them. I mean, just think of the Comanche and various Caddoan speakers. There's a whole new world being articulated by that 14th century that the Spanish will walk into.
Well, that's excellent. It sounds. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say it just sounds like there's a ton more to come. Many more lines of research to pursue and more information out there. And Ed, I'll turn it over to you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add off of what Jack was saying, that there's this, obviously there's so many profound stories that come out of the promontory collections and the archaeological record that I think resonate with a lot of people. And I think one of the things for me is that you recognize that not only are these profoundly human stories, but they resonate with a lot of contemporary Native nations, descendant communities that I think rightly appreciate how these elevate positive aspects of the past that don't normally get foregrounded in a lot of more widely distributed popular media. These aren't the stories that get covered. And I think moving even beyond Native nations, the human legacy for this is forcing us, nudging us in some cases to think about how and why it was that these people from diverse backgrounds speaking different languages came together when they did. It forces these really important social questions that I think are perhaps just as timely as questions about fluctuations in environment and food productivity. What was it that motivated these people to come together? How did they successfully live alongside one another? Well, those are the important lessons that I think that we really can lean into today. And again, it underscores what a tremendous record all of this is at Promontory, and the very four-field work that Jack and Joel and all their collaborators have been engaged in.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all. I would like to just kind of bring this to a close here, but I do want to give each of you, everyone on here, a chance to make a closing statement of whatever direction you prefer, whether it's about the collaboration that went into it, the book itself, and maybe the reception since then, and just thoughts about the research. And I guess I'll just go around in my arrangement of screens on my screen. Gabe, if you want to start us off and just kind of give your closing thoughts.
Circle back to me. I'm still thinking about any final closing thoughts, but I think I mentioned most of what I had to talk about. But
okay,
it's just been a real pleasure being part of this.
I did spring that on you, Jess. If it's okay, I can spring it on you instead. If you have some thoughts you just want to share.
Well, I guess it's something that I would like to think a bit more about, but I would say that it's been just a fabulous collaboration for me. And going back to that fortuitous meeting with Jack in 2014, sort of shows the way that someone else mentioned serendipity, but also relationships and how these things cause good research to emerge. And so I think the relationships that Jack and Joel have forged and created, and that we've all been part of in this project, have really led to this kind of productive, insightful work that's been done. And I do hope that it continues, and Jack and Joel are both retired, but I certainly have plans with my students to continue doing things, including things along the lines of what Joel was mentioning, and exploring connections between the Promontory Cave site and other locations like Franktown Cave, or like sites in Idaho on the Snake River Plain, or sites to the south. So there's a lot of projects that I am thinking about or actively working on as well in this area, and I hope that as time goes on, we can keep many of these connections going and going in different directions as Jack and Joel suggested. So, and then thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. Ed, would you like to give your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think, for me, so much of my deep involvement with, the parish material culture, it's often at the forefront of my mind that visibility remains such a big issue. And it's just this general invisibility of these craft products, the labor involved in it, the skill and sophistication, which again, cross-culturally is the efforts of women predominantly, that has been largely invisible. And so it behooves us to, as Jack and Joel and everybody else have been doing, kind of maximize what we can learn from these assemblages, and to be able to do it in such dialogue and conversation with contemporary descendant communities makes it all the more impactful and meaningful. For me, it very much speaks to sort of the model of the type of four-field scholarship that we need to be doing, not just because it's the right way to do it, it's good scholarship and good science, but because it's going to be the most impactful and most meaningful and the most resonant with diverse stakeholders.
Great. Thank you so much. And Gabe, do you feel ready now?
Sure.
Excellent. All right. I'll turn it to you.
Well, there's something that Ed's pointed out, and Jack as well, and Joel. One of the big differences between the Promontory Project and a lot of, I think, Great Basin scholarship of previous decades was this focus at the Promontory Caves of how this is cultural history as opposed to, economic focused or cultural ecology. And that ties very much into the fact that the Promontory Caves are the history of descendant communities today. And going forward, that's always going to be, I think, a big aspect of the project. That looking at the pottery, there's ties not just to Fremont and Dene peoples, promontory peoples, but the descendant communities that pottery points of connection to. And I think that includes people like Kiowa and Kiowa Apache and on the plains today, which is a very, very interesting and divergent view from, I think, a lot of previous focus. And there's going to be an interest there. And again, because the Promontory Caves and work like the gambling material, the gaming, the pottery, these are looking at topics that are, again, very different from what a lot of research and media attention focuses on. These aren't stories of warfare and conflict and conquest. These are stories of alliance and intermarriage and friendship building, people working together, finding common purpose in the past, which are, very relevant today, but also explain a great deal about people's histories today. And I think there's a lot of insight to be found there and a lot to be learned from going forward in ways that maybe defy some conventions.
Great. Thank you so much. And so I will turn it over to Joel and Jack. I don't know which order you'd like to do it in, but if you could each just say a few words likewise, and then I will have a few words of my own to close us out after that. So whichever of you would like to start, I'll turn it over to the two of you.
I'm going to give Jack the final word because he's much better at expressing final words than I am.
Okay. Thank you, Joel.
So I'm going to go first, and then you're going to go second.
Oh, okay. Then I get that too.
I've had two projects in my life that stand out as very different. One of them was a project that we did in central Utah at a place called Fish Lake. And in that project, for various reasons, we had involved native peoples, people from the Kacherin Band, the Paiute Ute tribe, and also the Kanash Band. And to have them involved gave a totally different dimension to the project. And of course, it was a field school. And so the students were interacting with those individuals as well. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as a consequence, we had a session at a Great Basin Conference the following year or so, invited by Bob Kelly. And one of the papers that one of those Native peoples, a lady named Rena, I'll just use her first name, she titled her paper, Making My Circle Complete, which basically said archaeology enabled her to connect with her unwritten past. I mean, this was a very emotional moment for me, and I think for some of those that were involved in the project. And the second project that stands out in my mind is this one, the Promontory Project, because of the involvement, especially due to Jack's efforts of people like Bruce Starlight and the Shoshone folks, Patty and her, was it her grandson who came out, and what transpired there in the cave with them. It was a very special and tender moment that we all experienced there. And that's one of the things that brings archaeology, especially makes it such an important part of the social sciences in my mind, that it brings this deep time perspective. And as Ed pointed out, these kinds of things, these kinds of interactions with people from different cultural backgrounds and such were happening in the past. And it's really only sites like Promontory. We didn't get anything like this at Fish Lake, which was, these were all open sites. I mean, I did Antelope Cave. We had just what he said, 100-to-1 perishables versus non-perishable artifacts. We missed so much. But seeing these kinds of interactions that we had with Native peoples from very different backgrounds just meant a lot to me and helped me understand why I love archaeology so much. So that would be my final thought. I think that we need in the future to do as much of that kind of work collaboratively with Native people as we possibly can. Okay.
Thank you, Joel. There's one thing I want to remember to do, and in case I forget, I'll do it first. Your predecessor, Reba Rausch, had a major hand in soliciting this volume. We actually weren't thinking of it. It was a grant application. I won't say duty. It was a pleasurable duty to have that SAA session. We were really spinning off some articles, like one that Jess was involved in, like Sabrina Shirazi, one of Beth Shapiro's students, the sexing of the bison hides, spinning those off. We were really eyeing doing the monograph that's required to draw this work to a conclusion for at least this part of it. It was Reba that came to us and said, how about an edited volume? And we were probably about 2/3 of the way through our research results. So we'd like to thank Reba for the foresight in soliciting the volume from us, and for everything she did to bring it to fruition with you, the University of Utah Press, as you and your colleagues have done. To other colleagues, I would say, often these kinds of hunter-gatherer records, and certainly for Dene people, are rather faint in the archaeological record. People like Dene Seymour in the deeper Southwest have contended with this. How could we identify Apachean sites in this time period? And it's also a challenge. I have some subarctic and northern plains background and experience, but when I move into a Great Basin or southwestern setting, I'm not familiar. So when I see a hide preparation implement that I would call a chitho in the Canadian subarctic, there's a huge learning curve that goes with all of these things. Well, maybe that's like an end scraper. It's typical of everywhere. There's nothing remarkable about that. Having access to a colleague like Joel, who is, well, really Mr. Eastern Great Basin in terms of archaeology, has been invaluable. But in terms of any colleagues who listen to this, we're certainly receptive to and interested in hearing ideas about this, because it's an immense geographic scope that needs to be covered to understand this very large human history. And for any Indigenous people that might be interested in this, our resources are somewhat limited relative to the scale of interest we understand there can be. From the gatherings that Bruce Starlight has hosted at Tsuut'ina in Calgary, for example, I'm aware that there's Pacific Coast interest, there's Alaskan interest, there's Northwest Territories interest in our research. We don't have it within our means to reach out to everyone, but for any communities who are interested in this, we're more than receptive. At some point, Ed and I've talked about this, we'd like to convene skilled moccasin makers and perhaps other perishable makers at the University of Utah where these collections are, because I see a parallel between the language revitalization work that our linguist colleagues do so vital to keeping languages alive in Indigenous communities. The capacity to practice these skills is also a culturally enlivening thing that these collections can stimulate if First Nations people have access to them, can see them, can reflect on them. So we're very amenable to working with communities. And at some point in the future, we'd like to convene groups of skilled artisans to do that very thing. And from my previous experience with some, say that Sally Rice and I organized at the University of Alberta for the Indigenous Languages, a training that goes on there. The stories that emerge that are not about these things are equally compelling. People start to talk about things in their life in the most enlightening ways. I'll end off there.
Thank you so much, Jack, and Joel as well. And to everybody here, I'm just going to speak for one final minute. I know we've gone on pretty long here, but I just want to kind of wrap this up. And I will ask that all of you, if you could just please stay on just for a minute or two after we finish recording so we can say a proper goodbye. But you've all been very generous to show up here today. I really appreciate you showing up and having this great conversation. For our listeners, we have the book here. It's Holes in Our Moccasins, Holes in Our Stories. I will have the link posted along with this podcast, but you can always find it on our website, uofupress.com, all one word. And again, you can find this, the video recording will always be on our YouTube page, and the audio only podcast version is available at our Spotify site. So scrolling all the way back up here, the YouTube page is University of Utah Press channel, and the Spotify podcast is U of U Press podcast. So thank you again, all of you. And to our listeners, look forward to more of these coming in the future. I'm really happy with the way this went and that we're back up and running now. So my final note, just to build off of what Jack said, I had no hand in making this book. This was Reba's book all the way through. She's the one responsible for it, and she deserves all the credit. So no one should mistake that as anything that I had something to do with. But I was really happy to get to talk with you all. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day.